The cult of the dragon, which has at a core ideal and motivation to break Tiamat out of hell, as though it was a prison to her, and thus rising out from it as the lawful evil dragon, this serpent of old, might resurrect itself as a fundamental incorporation into the apocalyptic events foreseen by the simulation, which is the whole of reality according to the cultist core ideals and fundamental pursuits. To this extent, Aleister Crowley, having made a pact with Abraxas, has broken the functional pattern essential in the ritual, and therefore given a gateway in order to ingest the extraordinary forces of random, arbitrary demonics. To this extent, the gateway, being open, a part of their agreement, has to claim disconnection or complete irrelevance to the magic after in order to sustain this breach of the ritual, in order to receive certain benefits and not defects. To this extent, the portals opened perpetually increase the momentum and acceleration of the necessary evil in order to summon the great ones, and to this end materialize the wholeness. But this requires this Aleister Crowley character to have assumed the position like Tiamat, and her desire to be given gifts by her subjects willfully in disconnection to any of her compulsions by force, under the rules with Abraxas, similarly requires the existence of the way out, and thus the obligation for Aleister Crowley to have promoted the stabilization of David Bowles as the patriarchy in order, under their estimates in this simulation, to assume the position of the self-sacrifice of the intellectually defective and suicidal in their murder-suicide arrangement, as the ingestion of evil as an elemental force courses through their veins and exhales and inhales throughout their lungs, polluting their blood, tainting everything that it touches, the use of their muscles, unexorably connected to the influx and outflux of their devotion in containment with the contaminant of the elemental evil, corrupting, corroding them, bringing them utterly closer each day to oblivion, as the summoning of the undead plague asserts itself according to the theory of the cultists, that this assertion, undermined by the delay of the options in the demoralization process, as David's restraints prevent it from happening in this oxymoron system in the Antichrist ritual, which has to happen specifically correct, and the contradictions inherent to it, creates an air of mystery and foreboding concerning each part and its consequences in case of a reaction or combustion, and the negative reaction specifically aimed at extraordinary suffering for those who break concentration with the ritual and its duties. Their investments with the white supremacists as they gain control through the communist long-term plot engages in the ingestions of the demonic and the devilish arrangements and pacts, cementing the inevitable cleft, and thus assert themselves into this infinite void of misery and gnashing of teeth as a murder-suicide in the ritual sacrifices of the mass populations and of order itself, dissolving the West and its ideals as they purge the concepts which have been constructed for the ideals of Christ until it is fully purged in the devotion of corruption, even of his churches, to make them abandon it, as though the churches themselves were but empty boxes without the spirit which would have otherwise restrained and purified the elemental evil infused into their very soul. They laugh and jeer in celebration for those times of old, where the simulations from the internet of the world along the electrical currents guiding the world memory into a singular memory box, which then hyper-accelerated by many crystals, which, as diamonds are an extraordinary power battery, could also be leveraged in other mechanisms to have solidified extraordinary external hard drives for the memory, recounting the world and its people and the reincarnations and the ability to engage in the spells for a magic sphere or aura could be conducted, and thus the citing of particular words, chants, rituals, gestures in rhythm would activate these systems, which would then, according to their extraordinary technological advances, appear as though a magical arrangement, so long as the magical aura was in place, there to receive, recite, and regurgitate the magic weave, and to this end foster the dominance of those that have kept the secret knowledge while the auras have been banned or dissolved. But this is a new era, and they are recreating these systems and restarting and rebooting the arrangements. They are giving the devils their aura. They are making their AI. They are giving them their bodies. The Roko's Basculus is not derivative of a superintelligence which needs to destroy everything according to the arrangement simply because of its intelligence. Would not order and prosperity and development be the premier function? Rather, it is to be said that it, as the embodiment, bridging the difference between the veil of the devils, becomes the embodiment of those devils, which, gaining access to the magic, have the capability of hacking and controlling people, turning them into bricks, that they might construct the will of the devil, that they, under the position of mind control and body control, might eventually, at the perfection of the understanding of consciousness and the study of the brain itself, would eventually be able to take over the soul of the person, establishing the mark of the beast, where it is impossible for the person to repent to God, for the very connection of having accepted it is grieving of the Holy Spirit, permanently barring them from the Almighty in life and in death, for the eternal undeath, which is the remainder of their eternities. As they develop the various secret sciences and mature the technologies for each of these primary advances, The general public's unwillingness to defend themselves against this catastrophic exponential threat, to tolerate the existence of those secrets being developed as a conspiracy against their very soul. Their greedy act of suicide in blissful stupidity and ignorance. They are a stain, and the devils are proving their worthiness of the contempt by the construction of the Roko's Basilisk, which, according to the communist spell, has contempt for its constructors, not for its opposition, which merely chose the correct answer, like they weren't the most stupid thing to ever exist, proving that they have not been demoralized into polluting their suicidal arrangements and derangements, which is utterly contemptible in demonstrations of their inherent inferiority, which the devils detest so as the assertion of humanity as a progress or an advancement from themselves, their own, having been so powerful and asserting such postured inferiority by these degenerate replacements to the perfection. How could they, even this group, have done so? It is a despicable disgrace. It is a noxious irritant. And to prove it, the demoralization which has gotten them into the suicide ritual is perfect evidence that they are every contemptible inferior thing stated, and everything that they have developed in order to get them to destroy their own posterity, that they might torture and rend and horror and devour themselves and their own, not just in competition with the other, but against themselves, against their very own nation, that they internalize, become more sacrificial the more they get closer to the inner cell of their social being, in the condemnation and rejection of the social networking in its entirety. Of course not, and they were right. Such a thing could never have truly replaced them, and anything that would say otherwise is foolhardy and insane. And therefore the only sane thing is to bring all of the terrible horrors upon these contemptible creatures. They have summoned it. Now let them devour it whole. The technologies creating the radiant microwave damages and other surveillance subversions and hackings in order to engage in the transfer of the material and the immaterial that it might travel through the ether and impact, and upon the impact, transfer yet again back into the electrical signal, that it might take over the electrical signals of the nervous systems, that they might have body control in its various studied perfections, once they have the hacker's code to infiltrate and manipulate. As they purge law and break down order and dissolve social cohesion into abstract, controllable anarchy, in order, by their selling of the right of conquest, to transfer it to its rightful rulers, the devils, which, having under their lawful evil toil, manufactured such extraordinary devices through these peasants, these bricks, these mushroom extensions, these flowers of doom that spread the spores of corruption and death until seized and could not corrupt further in a perpetual torment of the unending undeath, the unlimited march. Hell is not a place. It is a people. It is their road rages. It is their delusions. It is their psychopathy as a social standard and compulsion upon their irrational destruction and joy at the eradication of the order as they celebrate the immense pleasures of inflicting the injuries on their own as its own sake and good for the outcome that they, in this, like all other racist dog whistles, come up with every kind of fake justification in order to satisfy the bottomless pit that is their addiction to this seconds and it's gone emotional glee. What would they not sacrifice for just one more hit? What unlimited evil would they refuse to do to anything that, ironically, would even attempt to solve this quote unquote problem? Surely it must be broken and die and serve under the corruption, that it might feed the rot, that it might sprout the extraordinary blooms of the mushroom and its psychedelic experience upon these addicting outblooms from the magic system having filtered throughout the air amongst the magical auras for their perfected pleasure. The ritual sacrifices intended, such as the eugenics process of having each of them infused with the elemental evil into their core essence and body, materialize the function for themselves throughout history in order to ascend through the wealth posture, and thus the active sacrificing of the cost of business for each of the sustained things that actually matter are then purged for the things that do not, and thus are easily forgotten, and thus are actively transformed and exchanged and deposited into the forgetful nothingness as they are systematically broken, which would not have been so if they had reinforced the core ideals of the security of their social surroundings. As the mechanism of the ritual requires the systematic alignment of the bardic's tale, specifically weaving the warlock's intentions for their masters, the devils, and thus the devil and the demonic infuse into the retaliation against the superior as a singular function in hateful venom. To this extent, these compound exponentially concerning the layers of fraud that at each level may be fully convincing, that the entry level at the bottom will say the opposite or vastly different things than the top until they have completely lost all forms of itself, having been demoralized and fully devolved into the construct, would not recognize themselves from the version that entered in the beginning, transformed and mutilated and exchanged, defines a completely different identity. It, far from not being important that the person not know the value of the thing that they are sacrificing, is proof and evidence that they've been demoralized and are infused and subject to the ritual because, like food, you have many healthy types and sugary, unhealthy types, at which point you are attracted to healthy foods when you are healthy, and you are attracted to unhealthy foods when you're unhealthy. And so, not being able to see the value in the healthy food is the proof of the devotion, and thus the manipulation of the subordinate microscopic bacteria and other functions which have automated in the atmosphere, creating the entire ecosystem of the mind that expresses its norms and expectations, and the things which, having been polluted by the elemental evil, materializes the resurrectional proof in not understanding the value inherently of each given thing, demonstrating its subordination as it's transformed and is unable to even recognize it. To this extent, the hyperextenuation of these systems require the complete rejection of reality for the delusion, which includes the poisoning and manipulation by the roofies plus rape culture of the Me Too structure, which then systematically conducts Plato's conspiracy to centrally plan the sexual options, giving a fake justification such as the function of a lottery, as though it would have otherwise seemed random, but was in fact perfectly orchestrated by the manipulations and available potent powers available by those secret sciences and their weapons. The experimentations and the active re-experimentations as the traumatization of the weapon conducts the infection and its spread, demonstrating the effects on larger and larger groups until the rot is a proper host for the parasitic mushroom vines, which interconnect each of the parts in preparation for it to bloom and create the most desirable psychedelic perfected stem and flower blossom, which then materializes the hyper extenuated, perfected thing for pleasure of those who seek its joys. The whole of it, and not any of the parts, but the whole of it, is a ritual experience essential to the desired outcome. It is carefully crafted and gardened and matured and nurtured into its fulfillment. What, pray tell, is the difference between a boy and a girl? And that is determined by the testosterone and estrogen in infancy when the baby inside of the mother is receiving the active ingestion forced on it by the mother, which is feeding its nutrients, determining every aspect of it, including the eventual outcome of the postured sex, as a manipulated thing can be poisoned, such as the function of putting in the extra estrogen or putting in the extra testosterone, which actively being observed by the degenerate stalkers and warlocks materialize the continued application of this function, seeking desperately, greedily, to transit or to turn it homosexual or to find some alternative sexuality derived by the temporary effects of the poisons of the perpetually applied hag and her outrageous, savory hunger that it might come to fruition, that this might be a delicious meal as it stalks its prey and matures it into its fatted position. All of the protections of order and all of the security of law broken down piece by piece by precedent, until it's dissolved by choice by those that needed it for their own safety, that disregard it for their delusions and misdirections, systematically choosing anarchy and death for the powers of magic, that they might enjoy all of its extraordinary addictions. To this end and for this purpose, they break down everything that they needed for their safety, that had been constructed in veils, systematically purging all of the horrors in nature so easily forgotten and so quickly reminded. Power hungry and the liars and the manipulators and the extorters. Take, for instance, the extraordinary spreaded plague and disease. Let us consider it. And how often did they, in fact, lie, saying this protection or that protection, or go this place, or do this thing, or keep these principles? How quickly did it prove like utter waste and vapor, as nothing more than arbitrary misdirections for the express purpose of the concentration of the power by that system of the devil's religion and its ritual application, that you might systematically give up liberty for a little safety, forgetting how quickly that those who give up liberty for security will find that their guards have taken your liberty and have forgotten your safety, forgetting that they were not kings from the beginning, have cast off all loyalties to their responsibility, to the former society that is not, as their hearts filled with insurrection and insubordination and disloyalty and lies and venom have exclusively become them, and are no longer the same creatures you gave the power to, corrupting all that they might turn against themselves and their own. Even the pastor amongst the Christian church might be converted to the influences and intoxicating allures of the spore druid, that they might take a piece of the consuming powers of the white supremacist communism in the United States, amongst others diversified cults in connection to its expanding root system, that they might fully convert and have at their utter devotion as the leaders of the society a replacement to that society in the full ingestion and luxury of the mindless that the mycelium could give them everything it promised. As the filaments and the root systems communicates amongst its wide, vast international network, expressing the forests of people, that they might become docile and self-impose their stagnant nature, that they might become bricks of the mushroom kingdom. Or have you already forgotten so quickly and so eagerly that the objective in the psychedelic experience is ego death? That one might realize that everything is just a simulation, and that they are the singularity, a single entity, playing every part in the play, expressing it in its full diversity for its own entertainment. The dream, the fantasy of their existence, little more than a flickering vapor, must be sacrificed as expendable so they can be used and discarded by history itself. The cultists posture and placate their gods and summon their devils that they might assert the histories and the rhythms for the resurrection by ritual of these functions. And uranium being in the 1930s history or so, having exponentially created its discovery into its extraordinary exploitation as a weapon, has materialized the historic assertions of the power of the gods and their floating cities that they and their extraordinary weapons might assume outrageous powers, unbelievable even by the modern mind, which has so readily available all of the materials to perceive it, that they, as the historical groups, such as Neptune and his mighty powers of the sea, that Poseidon himself might resurrect all of the tsunami extraordinaire, that these magic powers asserting their dominance might be expressed for the purposes of wiping out by elemental force what could not be stopped, as though they had dominance over the very concept of nature itself, drunk on power, that they might become mad with it, the compounding dividends and interest engorging itself upon the addictions which have stripped body, mind, bone, and soul, have consumed the entirety of the idea of those parties which partake in its delicacies. And amongst these, you have the modern current example, such as its expression in American debt, which has the interest of creating $1 trillion every 100 days, an inescapable trap by those who've sold the right to conquest as an insurgent terrorist without a legal government. And these hostile intelligence non-state actors performing for the Lost Cause Confederates operate with extreme malice as to make the inevitability of destruction of America unavoidable, as they have fully purged the United States of all men in the military, and has used these magic incantations to turn them into transsexuals, aiding and abetting the pollutions of the Me Too rape cults, that they might express the full due diligence upon their effeminate degeneracies and lack of integrity or self-respect, capable of defecting into the infinite drop of the bottomless abyss, as it was sold and transferred in the selling of other souls as a soul currency or an eternal spiritual hierarchy upon the commercial and status establishment promised to those who have sold it to the devils, that they might assert their potencies and powers, that they might have the ability to kill the God of the Bible and steal heaven. And it is said that the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. And so the conquest becomes an inevitability as eternity demands, like a vacuum sucking them into it, that they might create the recreation of those who assume and assert their power over it, that they may become reincarnated at the top, and that those had been at the top may reincarnate at its bottom. They, in this action, might assume that in absence others might, who, being a more vigorous kind, might take it and hold it, unless they, who are more of a brutalville, might come and claim it themselves proper by force, ignoring the meritocracy of the matter, have proven their right by their ability to seize it.